just starting off here, just to start off here, this is a famous painting depicting Socrates drinking poison hemlock. So what does that mean? Well, Socrates famously, um, he managed, by being such a perpetual troll in ancient Athens, he managed to piss enough people off that he was eventually tried for, he was brought to trial for corrupting the youth and atheism, even though he adamantly denied both of these charges. And he was not only convicted, but actually sentenced to death. And months later, in jail, famously, some of his students came to break him out of jail, and he famously voluntarily chose not to flee death. But this is in his dialogue on Phaedo. He voluntarily chose to stay behind to be executed by, he was given the opportunity to drink poison hemlock. So this is actually seen as a more merciful form of execution back then. It wasn't torturous. It wasn't considered as painful. It was actually seen as a little bit of a mercy, a little bit of a more lenient death sentence, to just give someone the option to just drink some poison and like basically go to sleep and not wake up. But you know, there's a lot of parallels historically between a figure like Socrates and even say Jesus and certain like kind of martyr narratives. This is a famous painting. I actually forget who it's by, but it's maybe we can actually Google. Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Socrates, painted in 1787 in neoclassical style. Yes, he drew on Plato's Phaedo. Phaedo is one of Plato's more famous dialogues, which describes Socrates' last days in jail, awaiting his execution. And he has a really interesting discussion on philosophy of mind, philosophy of soul, on the nature of death, on dualism, on even some of his broader dualist metaphysics. But anyway, this is a famous painting of Socrates at his execution. Let's see what the meme is actually about with that context in mind.
Obsessed with you?
Me obsessed with you.
What's your problem?
No one wants to see this.
Said me obsessed with you. Okay, that's interesting. It's commentary, I guess, on Socrates' controversial, you know, his nature as a politically and socially and culturally controversial figure. I will confess I'm not 100% getting the point of that first meme, but for the second one, people who read Law of Attraction and self-help books, people who read philosophy and classical literature. This is interesting.
What's your problem?
No one wants to see this. It's very disturbing.
Two people aren't allowed to be happy?
Well, you're allowed to be happy, but not in front of me, so let's move it down.
Oh.
That was funny. That was funny. Yeah, so we do see a lot in the 21st century. You know, we see people use words like pseudoscience often. Well, I think we need to use a term like pseudo-philosophy, because we actually see a lot of things like what I would call pseudo-philosophy, where it's a lot of things that are kind of trying to engage in a more metaphysically rich, and you could say therefore philosophically minded approach to things, but just doing it in a way that's totally detached from any, you know, legitimate like philosophical tradition, certainly totally detached from any scholarship. And so I kind of like the examples they were using there. What was it? Law of Attraction and self-help books. These are this is kind of modern literature that will often actually engage in things like make certain metaphysical claims, like Law of Attraction, make ethical claims a lot, like in self-help books. They'll basically be engaging in like metaphysics and ethics and a lot of philosophical concepts, but they're just doing it from a totally ignorant perspective. And yeah, so for somebody like me, you know, the people who read philosophy and classical literature, for an actual philosopher like me, that stuff can just come across as so frustrating. Because it's just so totally detached from any real philosophical basis. It's just frankly kind of philosophically ignorant. It's coming from an ignorant perspective, but yet it's nonetheless like trying to do something philosophical, even if not by its own admission. And it does come across that way, so I appreciate this meme here.
No one wants to see this. It's very disturbing.
Yeah, it's very disturbing. I don't
Two
want to
people
see
aren't
this.
allowed to be happy?
Well, you're allowed to be happy, but not in front of me, so let's move it down.
Oh, philosophy versus physics. I kind of like this one. Yes. Base. Holy shit. That one was base. That was my favorite philosophy meme so far. Holy shit, that was base. So hold up. Philosophy versus physics. Okay. Now, when they say physics, they probably don't mean in the context of this meme, they probably don't mean it in the as in like physics, the subject you study in school and that you took a class on in high school and maybe college as well. They probably mean more physics in a broader sense, to mean what we would often today call the natural sciences, or just, you know, empirical investigation into the physical world. Actually, it comes from the Greek word physis, Physis. It's pronounced physis, which literally means nature, right? So physics arguably could be taken to just mean something like, and how it might have been referred to even just a couple hundred years ago, as like the philosophy of nature. But now today we come to just call that science. So I just want to clarify, when they're saying philosophy versus physics, I'm reading this almost a little bit more as a like philosophy versus science meme. But some of what that, like, what we just got there was actually really based, and I like it. Let's break it down. Empiricism, useful. Innovation, scientific method. Okay, empiricism, useful, innovation, scientific method. So what does that mean? So I actually highly recommend, for anybody who's interested, my very first video upload ever. It's called "What is Philosophy?" It's one of my less flashy videos. I didn't edit it to have any memes or anything. It's mainly just me talking. But I'm kind of just answering a question that I used to get asked a lot when I first decided to leave law school to go do a master's in philosophy, which is like, you know, it was not, what are you going to do with that degree? But instead, the most common question I often would get asked is just like, philosophy, what's that? I don't even know. And what I ended up doing there in that video, though, was I did actually end up at one point talking a little bit about how, like, you know, philosophy is even more prior to science. And the scientific method just presupposes a whole slew of philosophical baggage. And I'd recommend, if you're interested in this subject, you could watch that first video of mine. But so what we're talking about here: empiricism, useful, innovation, scientific method. Okay, and then we'll talk about what that says in a second. So scientific method is presupposing a very specific approach to epistemology. Epistemology is philosophy of knowledge. Scientific method is presupposing a very empiricist-heavy approach to epistemology. What does that mean? Empiricism, empirical. So science is effectively inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is using empirical observation to engage in probabilistic inferences. It's sort of attempting to reason what is the most probably true explanation for the evidence at hand as I've observed it, right? That's classic scientific method. That's what empirical observation-based kind of probabilistic reasoning is, which is also known as induction. So, you know, scientific method is heavily presupposing empiricism, or a very empiricist-heavy approach to epistemology, which empiricism originates, well, at least in a modern context, is strongly associated with Anglospheric thinkers, that's philosophers in the English-speaking world, especially like Great Britain, in the Enlightenment period, especially in like the 18th and 19th centuries. So figures like John Locke, and later a figure like Hume. But empiricists, so actually the Lockean view is kind of like the archetype, the model for like modern empiricism. But it's you may have heard this before, like a blank slate kind of approach to the idea that there is no such thing as innate ideas. So innate ideas is actually Cartesian language that originates with Descartes, which is a more rationalist approach to epistemology. But it's to say that, you know, there are no innate ideas, right? That no knowledge exists prior to experience. All knowledge is a posteriori. It's after the fact. It's after you've experienced something. That would be a more radically empiricist approach, that literally everything you know just comes from and after experience, and that there is nothing known a priori. A priori would mean known prior to experience. Now, what is interesting if you study philosophy is you see that sometimes that empiricist approach seems the more natural or intuitive to people. I would argue maybe it's not so natural and intuitive, and it's more a bias, the result of modern science and scientism and certain assumptions that instills in people. But nonetheless, for a lot of your average everyday people, they tend to assume something like an empiricism Or something like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, knowledge is just the things you've experienced, right? All knowledge must be just after you've experienced it. But what's interesting, if you really study epistemology and philosophy, you see there's all kinds of logical and epistemic and metaphysical problems that arise from trying to take this strict empiricist view. Because how do you do things like account for the validity of your sense experiences under an empiricist view? And your sense experiences need to be accurate and reliable in order for you to be able to say that the information they're feeding you is justification for knowledge, right? So in other words, it's your classic like Cartesian dream hypothesis, or like, are we living in the matrix right now, or a brain in a vat somewhere, or am I just crazy? Am I just schizo? Is this just like one of those cheesy movies where the big M. Night Shyamalan twist at the end is that the protagonist is actually some crazy person in a straitjacket somewhere, and the whole movie was in their head. um if you're going to say that all knowledge exists after experience and there's nothing known a priori, well, how then do you know that your sense experiences are accurate and reliable? Because if you're going to take a radically empiricist view, the only legitimate answer you could give to that question is, well, through my sense experiences. But at that point, you're now saying my sense experiences are accurate and reliable because because of evidence I have experienced through my sense experiences. But in order for that evidence to confirm that they're accurate and reliable, it would have to first be the case that they're accurate and reliable. In other words, this is what's known as begging the question, right? This is circular. You can't justify knowledge in the claim that my sense experiences are accurate and reliable and therefore form a legitimate basis for justifying further knowledge. You can't justify the knowledge of that claim, the accuracy and reliability of your sense experiences themselves, by using your sense experiences. That's going in a circle, because that's the very thing at issue. That's what's known as begging the question. So there's actually a lot of issues with empiricism epistemologically, but what this meme is kind of pointing out is that empiricism is or the empiricist assumptions underlying modern science tend to be just that. They tend to be assumptions. They tend to just be assumptions. You tend to just, in order to go into the scientific method, you're kind of just operating under the assumption that my senses are accurate and reliable, and I can trust this evidence that's been collected and observed. And I'm just going to, and it only if I then conditionally, operate under that assumption, such that, like, if and only if these, this empirical evidence as collected through my sense experiences is accurate and reliable, well, then I can reason to these probabilistic conclusions and start to engage in, like, scientific theory and whatnot. But I guess it's a good example. I guess what I'm trying to say, and I think what this meme is trying to say, is how philosophy is sort of the more fundamental prior thing here, because philosophy is the only way you're going to engage in even epistemologically, justifying and accounting for the things that need to be in place, all these assumptions that need to be in place in order to even do the scientific method. So that was one thing the meme was pointing out. It also used the phrase useful, which is, this common assumption people have that, science is, oh, well, that's useful in the sense that it's, it brings results. It results in technological achievements and developments in, I don't know, modern medicine and engineering and all of these things that have tangible results. And this is why everybody says, don't go to grad school for philosophy, just go study science. But in reality, that's a misconception I like to push back on a lot. Philosophy is the most globally relevant thing. Again, I'd refer you to my video on what is philosophy for some more explanation as to why. But philosophy is applicable to everything and is necessary in order to engage in anything, in any kind of thought process, including modern science. Science operates under a host of philosophical assumptions. And if you can't account for those assumptions philosophically, then you have no science. So if you really love science so much, then you best respect the philosophers who help make that science possible. So I think that's some of what this meme is kind of getting at. But this is Plato and Aristotle. So Plato was the most famous student of Socrates. We already talked about him. Plato went on to found an academy, and Plato is a name most people have heard, and most people have also heard the name Aristotle. So whereas Plato was originally Socrates' student, Aristotle was Plato's student and studied at his academy. So this is an older Plato and a younger Aristotle, as in like Aristotle the student, right? An older Plato the teacher, professor, a younger Aristotle the grad student or whatever. And they're talking here. This is a famous painting, actually. It's a Renaissance painting. But I like how some of the things that are being talked about here contrasted with science, it's going to start. So we just talked about science is really just getting into like an empiricist study of like the physical world around you in this limited manner that operates under a host of assumptions. But what does philosophy then do? Metaphysics. You see how rapidly it's cycling through that. It's like hard for me to, I don't even think I'll be able to break them all down, but it's basically saying very rapidly metaphysics, teleology, theology, ethics, aesthetics. So these are all the things, these are all categories that, they're not physical objects, right? They're things that can't be accounted for in a simply, materialistic worldview, or that which is really the extent of what the science can engage in is just measuring the physically extended world. But in philosophy, you can engage in metaphysics. We've already said physis is a Greek word for nature. So we get words like physical. Meta is the Greek word for beyond. So metaphysics means like beyond or transcending the physical. Studies of being itself. Studies of, teleology. Logic itself. Logic is immaterial. Logic is abstract. There is no like physically measurable object in the world that is like the law of non-contradiction. That there's no object. It's not like a planet. An astronomer studies in the sky. It's like, oh, that's the law of non-contradiction orbiting the sun there. It's not like a thing in the physical universe. Teleology, telos means end. Teleology is like the study of endedness. That is the direction in which things are pointed, that things have natural ends they move towards, right? Like saying the end or the telos of an acorn is that of a flourishing tree, like an acorn grows into a tree, and that there's like a directedness about it, like the motion of the acorn, that there's an internal principle of that motion. That's what it means to say it has a nature, right? To say it has a nature is to say it has a movement that isn't like inflicted upon it from the outside world, but that is actually coming from within it, and it's within its nature. Therefore, it's from within an internal source that it begins to move towards a predetermined end, or a fixed end. That being with the acorn, that of a tree, right? Of an adult flourishing tree. Then, of course, theology, philosophy of God. Or philosophy of divinity. I mean, just what is the divine? I mean, this doesn't have to translate to like a stereotypically Christian worldview or what have you. But these are just things we're rapidly cycling through, right? Fundamental logic, critical thinking. We already went over logic. Aesthetics. Aesthetics is a subfield of axiology. Axiology is a philosophy of value, right? Better or worse, good, bad. Aesthetics is perceptive value, beauty. Right? You could call it philosophy of beauty, right? How we evaluate our perceptions. Along with ethics is like philosophy of like behavioral value, philosophy of goodness. If aesthetics is philosophy of beauty, ethics is philosophy of goodness. But all of these value claims, value is not a physical object that you measure with measuring tape. These are all transcendental, like immaterial categories of things that you just cannot engage with the scientific method. And this is why I'm hammering on this is the point the meme is trying to make. It says philosophy versus physics, but I pointed out earlier, I think really by physics, they mean just more natural science. And so we can call it philosophy versus science. In science, it's like, yeah, you've got a few interesting things, right? You've got an empiricist heavy epistemology that, again, has a bunch of philosophical assumptions. But hey, if you just are willing to just sort of assume a bunch of philosophical baggage to be true, there's an empiricist epistemology you can use that is then useful, that can get us results, that can, create new technologies and achieve kind of practical goals. It lists off a few of those positive things about science, but you get to philosophy, and this is the point the meme is trying to make, is just look at this massive long list of things that cannot be approached through scientific inquiry, can only be approached through a more philosophical contemplation and reason. And and I would also argue, as a point of the meme, is that this much longer list of many things are also many of the very things that tend to concern most of us the most in our day-to-day lives. Right? In our day-to-day lives, we tend to not think as much about like the scientific method in the latest like journal publication on medical scientific data on like the clinical drug trials for some medicate. Like, I mean, yeah, there's some like scientists out there who that is their day-to-day life as they read about and talk about those things. But for most people, in our day-to-day lives, are far more concerned with things like ethics, goodness, and like what's a good person, what kind of person should I be, and how, what's the meaning of my life, aesthetics, what is beauty, logic, epistemology, knowledge, how do I know anything at all, what is knowledge, metaphysics, what is like even beyond the physical stuff we're measuring, what is being itself, being qua being, being as such, um teleology, do things have natural ends, do things have an essential, an essence about them, right, such that they have a thisness. This is a more or metaphysical question, but then what would come, I mean, if we're really getting classically Aristotelian with it, what would come with that thisness is final causality, right? It would be a very part of a what it is. The very part of what it is like what it's moving towards and what it's for, right? And that's the teleology. All of these things we're cycling through. Just that was a based video. All right, so I think this is supposed to be Nietzsche. It's the Chad meme. It's the Chad meme, but that's a clear Nietzsche mustache in my opinion, and the manner of dress it actually looks like they just photoshopped the Chad meme guy onto a portrait of Nietzsche. So this is clearly, I think, supposed to be Friedrich Nietzsche. I think I also, for anyone interested, I put out a video just maybe about a week ago now, on Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's philosophy, or some of the basics and introduction to it. So let's see. Nietzsche hated nationalism and nationalists, saw it as detrimental, praised Jews and Poles, called them great and proud peoples, and believed anyone could be Ubermensch. Okay, so this meme might be a little edgy. I maybe need to be a little careful on how I comment on this. So we start about the part about the praising Jews and Poles. And hated nationalism and nationalists. So I believe the first two bullet points, well, all of them really, I think is meant to be responding against people who associate Friedrich Nietzsche with a certain German right-wing populist political party from the 1930s and 40s. YouTube's terms of service or make it a little bit difficult for me to talk about this directly, but I'm sure everybody catches my drift here, and knows what I'm talking about. Nietzsche gets popularly associated with that political group, that German political group, due to certain terms Nietzsche coined, like Übermensch, which literally means overman or superman in English. There's certain Nietzschean buzzwords that certain German political party like to repeat sometimes. And there was a period of time in the 20th century when a lot of scholars like to attempt to associate Nietzsche with. Now, to be clear, Nietzsche died in the 1890s. So Nietzsche was already dead by the time of that German political party. But there was a period of time when scholarship liked to try to associate Nietzsche more strongly with that German political party that I can't name directly on YouTube. However, I'm not the expert on this, to be clear. I had actually a professor, when I did a grad course on Nietzsche, when I was working on my master's. My professor for that class was saying a lot of that comes from after Nietzsche's death. Nietzsche's sister went and herself kind of ended up developing some edgy political views and got more involved in that stuff, and kind of went and posthumously sort of repackaged newer editions and republications of Nietzsche's work in a way that was trying to be more friendly to that German political party I can't name directly on YouTube. But a lot of that wasn't coming from Nietzsche himself. And I think the point of this meme is kind of memeing on people who might. I do know personally some edgy Zoomer guys who are very right wing and will, whether with some degree of irony or not, kind of go full on ultra nationalist and maybe even say some semi positive things about certain radical political parties. Um, and I know a lot of those Zoomer guys might often be super into Nietzsche. And so I think the point of this meme is it's memeing on a little bit of a popular misunderstanding, and it's pointing out that, well, actually, yeah, this is true. Nietzsche was very much opposed to nationalism. He saw it as detrimental to his view of history and progression towards the Übermensch. He praised Jews and Poles, called them great and proud peoples, and there is a certain German political party from the 30s and 40s, the name of which I cannot mention directly on YouTube, who had some major issues with those ethnic groups and believed them to be politically and socially subversive peoples. And now it says he believed anyone could be the Übermensch. So I may take, this is the only point of this meme I may take a little bit of issue with, because in Nietzsche's view, the Übermensch wasn't like just necessarily something that anybody just became. It's like, oh, I'm the Übermensch. That's not really how that worked. In Nietzsche's view, the Übermensch was more of an idealized end towards which humanity was moving, right? Humanity was meant to be moving towards the Übermensch as like the next stage of human development, right? But it was a process of an almost Heraclitean flux or constant change and movement towards that end. So he, from like Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one of his most famous works, he describes man as like a rope tied between beast and overman or Übermensch. And what he means by that is he means to say if Nietzsche had this view that like he was opposed to he was opposed to like presentism and this idea of like looking at history from this idea of a fixed present moment and a fixed state of what human beings are now. And this idea that instead humanity is this constant process of change and struggle and strife and flux. But one that does have a sense of progression about it, which is interesting because it almost seems to bring in a certain evaluative standard, which Nietzsche is supposedly more of a moral anti-realist, and he has a lot to say on some of that. Beyond Good and Evil is a good work of his on this subject. I don't know if I agree with the way this last point is being framed, that believed anyone could be the Uber. Well, it's more about that humanity as a whole is undergoing a state of constant change that, gradually shifted humanity through strife and flux from beast into man, and that overman, Übermensch, is really just the next step beyond man, right? There's beast, then there's man, and then there's overman or Übermensch in the end. And that this is just more of something that all of humanity collectively is moving towards. It's not necessarily something that like an individual person becomes. And so that's why I take issue with this last bullet point. It's like framing it almost like there's this like, well, I'm the Übermensch, but as an individual, but you're not. Well, it kind of wasn't really that so much as it's, people are moving towards, or humanity is moving towards the Übermensch. Some people could be higher men, of stronger, with a stronger will to power, and more capable of defining and shaping that process of moving towards the Übermensch, right? So Nietzsche was very hierarchical in that sense, but even then it wouldn't necessarily be like the higher man is the overman, and then the lower man is not. It's more like the overman or the Übermensch is something all of humanity is moving towards, and the higher men are those with stronger strength of will who have the power, the ability and the will to power and the will to create and dare to be the ones to create new values and meaning as an extension of themselves to shape humanity's path evaluatively towards the Übermensch, as opposed to others who merely cling to presupposed systems of values, like two world theories. I highly recommend my Nietzsche video if anybody would like to know more about this. But yeah, so I kind of agree with the general point the meme's trying to make, that yeah, Nietzsche was not necessarily like in line with that certain German political group. the name of which I cannot mention directly on YouTube. But nonetheless, I do take issue with this last bullet point a little bit. Just philosophical. I think there's a philosophical issue with it a little bit. But let's continue. Men into philosophy. Yeah. Okay, so I thought it was maybe going to say men into philosophy and then say like women into philosophy, and then it would just be like nothing. Or like it was a point who's going to make. So on this point, I'll just say, if anyone wants to say, well, that's sexist, why is it men into philosophy? Well, to this day, philosophy is a huge sausage fest academically. So it's actually kind of interesting because in academia, generally, the only fields that are really truly still significant majority male are like very, very hard technical sciences. But when it comes to the social sciences and humanities, most of the social sciences and humanities fields are actually majority female. So I don't recall where this statistic is from, so you'll have to forgive me and just allow me to kind of cite this from the top of my head and just say I encourage you to look it up. I'm not making it up, this statistic. I just don't remember, and I don't feel like looking it up right now. But that was just looking at the gender breakdown, or just different demographic breakdowns for tenure track professors in America. And so take something like English. English is 70% women, 30% men. You see similar significant majority female breakdowns in a lot of social sciences like sociology and psychology. You see, and you see that in even other liberal arts like English. But philosophy, the statistic I'm remembering, philosophy was like 88, 89%, basically just about 90% male. And it's just weird because, like I said, there are some hard science fields that are like that still too. But again, in like the liberal arts and humanities and especially social sciences, not only is that not the norm anymore, it's like, if anything, it's the other way around. And so philosophy just kind of very interestingly stands out as being, like one of the only like arts, humanities, and socials, one of the only non-STEM fields, one of the only non-math science fields, one of the only humanities or social science fields that's just so majority male. And in any philosophy department is like, it's like all men, except for there'll always be this one woman, and they'll just openly admit that one woman is there as like a diversity hire, basically, like an affirmative action thing. And so it's kind of like there's one tenure track female philosophy professor who is like literally like artificially put there by design just to say that it's not 100% men, and then the rest are all men. And if you look at philosophy majors, it's like overwhelmingly men. It's just a very male discipline. Just to for anyone who's wondering, why is it specifically men into philosophy? Well, because philosophy is like one of the biggest sausage fest disciplines still left in the Western world.
Friend, I noticed that when we meet in a group to discuss just to have fun, we have to go through a certain ritual of humiliating each other with extremely the usual what I will do to your mother.
I know this guy, Slavoj Žižek. I know him. I just get his name wrong constantly. But he's from Slovakia, or is it Slovenia? I'm sorry. Is it Slovenian philosophy, Eastern Europe, former Czechoslovakia, or that area. And contemporarily, he's kind of known as like a Marxist, kind of philosophically, but it's interesting because he's actually like gone quite super or fairly anti-woke, and he's actually very critical of wokeism, and he had a pretty this is years ago now. This is like back in the late 2010s, but he had a pretty high profile debate with Jordan Peterson at one point. And but it's weird because they actually kind of agree on like being opposed to various woke things, and it was more that like Peterson kind of Jordan Peterson likes to like lump all of that stuff under these very broad categories of like Marxism and postmodernism, and I think like Žižek was taking issue. Although it's interesting because what I remember seeing that debate, and I remember it was interesting towards the end, Jordan Peterson kind of started pressing him and saying, well, look, if you believe all these things and in ways where like you and I actually agree on a lot of things, like why do you even bother to call yourself Marxist anymore if like Marxism is the thing that a lot of these wokies you don't agree with are identifying with, even if you believe they're like kind of misunderstanding Marxism or not applying it properly. Why do you even bother with that term? And I remember Zizek said towards the end, well, okay, fine. You know what? Maybe let's forget the word Marxist. Just call me a Hegelian. Call me a Hegelian. And I actually think that's a little more appropriate. I'd say Zizek falls into a still contemporarily pretty popular group of Hegelian influenced contemporary philosophy. Maybe even arguably Marxist adjacent, but he's certainly, I would say, a bit. I like that he made that clarification towards the end of that debate. Now, that being said, I'm not like super well read on Zizek. I've read a little bit of his stuff. I've seen some of his debates. I'm not super well read on him. But he's a really interesting guy, and that's who's talking right here.
In a group to discuss, just to have fun, we have to go through a certain ritual of humiliating each other with extremely the usual, what I will do to your mother, grave.
Jesus.
The most tasteless thing. Then, after 10 minutes of talking dirty, we tell to each other, okay, we paid our tribute to ugliness, we got rid of it, now we can finally be what we are and talk in a nice, polite way, you know? What I like it is that it is as if we have a certain perverse superego duty to talk dirty. And after you get rid of that, we can be what we are.
Zizek is certainly known for being a rather eccentric character. I don't even know what the hell he was going on about then. I don't even know what the hell that was about. But he's a bit of an eccentric character for sure. I like this. So here's another Socrates meme. I love ancient Greek philosophy. It's not like my most dedicated area of specialty, but it's an area of competence. I actually list it as an area of competence on my CV. Okay, POV, point of view. Of course, Socrates. Wait, okay. A random Athenian has just stopped you in the streets to ask you some questions, and it's your time to reply. Okay, so the random Athenian is it meant that the random Athenian is actually Socrates, or is it that your Socrates point of view and a random Athenian has stopped you, Socrates, to ask you some questions? A, of course, Socrates. B, yes, that is undeniable. Okay, no, yeah, so the random Athenian is Socrates. Okay, this is funny now. Sorry, it took me a minute to get this meme. This is actually funny. A, of course, Socrates. B, yes, that is undeniable. C, that is perfectly true. D, certainly that too is obvious. E, by Zeus, Socrates, that is entirely right. This is funny. So in a lot of Plato's dialogues, Plato wrote dialogues, they would be about Socrates, or kind of somewhat historical, maybe somewhat a little bit Plato's fan fiction. And they're often about Socrates getting into these like conversations with people discussing philosophical subjects. And Socrates would also have his little entourage of like his little students who would follow him around and talk to him about these things as well. This would be like Plato himself, Glaucon, different characters. And it's funny because a lot of times there will be huge parts of the dialogues where Socrates will just start ranting philosophically and talking about all these philosophical things. And the only, like, these long, lengthy, page-long, stretches where it's just Socrates going on. And then Glaucon, or Plato, one of his followers, will have a line in response where he'll just go, "Oh my God, you're right. You're absolutely right, Socrates. Yes, I completely agree. That's perfectly true. Certainly, Socrates, that is completely true." Like, literally, the only dialogue input from the other characters is just everybody sitting there glazing Socrates and agreeing with him on everything. And it's just like the thinnest excuse for a dialogue. So that's what makes this kind of funny. I don't know if you've ever read a Platonic dialogue. This is just how they read sometimes. It's just Socrates ranting and then everybody just agreeing with him and glazing the shit out of him. Alrighty, let us continue. Plato after winning arguments against his made-up characters. So, yeah, who is ripping on Plato's dialogue so hard right now? So that's kind of what I was just explaining. Although, okay, maybe a little bit of issue with made-up characters. There is a historical element to Plato's dialogues. It is a matter of scholarly debate as to just how historical versus ahistorical, these dialogues are. And a lot of the figures who appear in Plato's dialogues were historical figures. So this is maybe a little harsh. I don't know. I think this is a little harsh. To say this is a little harsh to accuse them, of all made up characters. But the idea is the same. So, Plato's writing these dialogues with Socrates, arguing with people, and then Socrates wins the argument. It's like, oh, ha, ha. I just won an argument with myself because it's all written by the same guy. It's funny. Although I think this one's a little overly harsh. But let's continue. Have you done your cynic duty as opposed to civic duty? The Cynics were an ancient Greek philosophical school in the Hellenic period. Um, so probably the most famous cynic historically. Some people may have heard of him actually. He's kind of weirdly had some popularity in the modern age, but it's Diogenes the Cynic. And Diogenes was a really freaking interesting character in Athens. He lived into like his 80s, but he basically lived in a barrel on the street corner of Athens, and it was said he only had one possession, or at one point he had two possessions: a candle, a candle, and a cup to like scoop water and soup and stuff. And so that's why he's often famously depicted. He's the guy here in the bottom left, Diogenes. Well, actually, I think all of these are meant to be Diogenes. Um, but the Cynics believed that virtue, cultivating cultivating the virtues of character was like the only thing one needed to live a good life, and there were no material possessions that were needed, and so they would live these deliberately um austere lives. And so Diogenes the Cynic, so it said he used to own the candle and the ladle, but then eventually he got rid of the candle because he realized actually the ladle was the only thing he really needed to like scoop water and soup and stuff. But anyway, Diogenes would live on a street corner in Athens in like a barrel. He would like masturbate in public, and he would like masturbate in public and like steal food from like dogs, and he was just really committed to this lifestyle of just living straight homeless and straight rough. And just as long as he did that, only then could he cultivate virtue and really live the true good life, and kind of also making this public show out of this public demonstration out of showing everybody, look, I have the better and more meaningful life what I'm doing, living like this, than what you all are doing with your materialism. And so, throw away all your stuff, tell people to get out of your sunlight. Oh, there's a famous story with Diogenes the Cynic where when Alexander the Great was at one point visited him, and when Alexander the Great went to visit him, he said, "Do you know who I am? I'm Alexander the Great. I can give you any wish you want." Because Alexander basically respected him. He had heard these stories of him as like this philosopher who's also kind of crazy, and he sort of respected the hell out of him. And basically, Alexander went and he said, "I'm Alexander the Great. I'm literally the most powerful man in the known world. I will grant you any one favor for you to impart your wisdom upon me. Tell me, what is it you want? You've really thoroughly impressed me, man. Tell me, I will do you a favor. Just tell me what it is." And Diogenes apparently famously said to him, "Sure, here's my favor. Get out of my sunlight. Get out the way. You're standing in the way of my sunlight." He was just standing there like sunbathing. Get out of my way. Just kind of based, I guess, kind of badass. And then this one here is a funny story too. Throw chickens at Platonus. So it's also said once that Plato had once attempted to give a famous definition of man, as so this is before Aristotle gave us our most lasting definition of rational animal. Plato had once attempted to give a famous definition of man that was featherless biped. Featherless biped, meaning like walking up on two legs but having no feathers, right, to distinguish from a bird. Because the idea, basically, the challenge was to try to define man in the simplest way possible. So the idea was, well, featherless biped, something that only has 2 feet but no feathers, right? So excluding birds and all other like 4-legged mammals and all that. And so one day, it said that Diogenes the Cynic broke into Plato's academy, or one day he got a live chicken, plucked it of all its feather, plucked all the feathers out of the chicken. So he just had this still living chicken that was all bloody and raw with all of its feathers peeled off of it and like flapping around and freaking out. Broke into Plato's academy, threw right in front of everybody, threw this like bloody raw still living chicken with all its feathers ripped out of it, so that this like featherless bleeding chicken starts like screeching and flailing around and running around Plato's academy, and then says to Plato in front of everybody, "Look," pointing at the featherless chicken, "Look, a human, a man. Look, Plato, a man, a featherless biped." just to like try to show Plato that was a dumb definition. So Diogenes was a very, very interesting character. So that's, you know, just some background on this. I think this is a very cute, clever little meme here. Have you done your cynic duty?
You have no idea because you're
Plato,
not here. I've been coaching here for 15 years. I have no idea because you're not here.
Maybe
you have no idea because you're not here. I've been coaching here for 15 years.
All right, so that's Plato, Socrates. So it's funny. I talked about this earlier in the stream, but basically, you know, Socrates famously, he was such a troll all the time, going up to people of Athens, making them feel dumb, that he eventually got charged with corrupting the youth and atheism. Now, he adamantly denied both these charges, but he was tried and convicted of these charges at trial by an Athenian jury, and then sentenced to death and was executed and drank poisoned hemlock. That's actually what's going on in this famous painting that we went over at the beginning, right? This is famous painting of Socrates committing suicide by drinking poison hemlock. But so what I believe this meme is referencing is at his trial. Socrates famously went up there, and now you would think at a trial, if you're facing like the death penalty, you would want to seem like very, you know, polite and cordial and apologetic and contrite and diplomatic, and you'd want to try to win the jury over. But Socrates just got up there and was basically a massive asshole and told everybody how stupid they were for not understanding him. And so I think, you know, why this guy's labeled Socrates, he's saying, you know, y'all don't understand. I've been doing this forever. I've been, you know, he's like basically going up against the whole Athenian jury. Now, Plato was Socrates' most famous student, and Plato was a young man at the time. And so I think the idea is like, you know, Plato, this young man, Plato's like kind of hanging out in the background quietly, like afraid to get involved, while Socrates is up here like, you know, mad dogging the whole freaking jury, Athenian jury, and going crazy at his trial. So that's funny. It's just one of those things. If anybody's Plato's Apology, Plato's dialogue Apology, it's actually one of his most famous dialogues. I'd also recommend it if you've never read Plato. It's a really good introduction because to Plato, because it deals in philosophy and it's a dialogue, but there's like a narrative going on. Apology is basically the description of Plato's trial. So there's sort of like drama going on. There's a story. It's kind of well written. It's more engaging, I think, than some of Plato's drier dialogues. If you've read Apology, this meme kind of hits, you know, I think, and is kind of funny. Anyway, so yeah, that actually brings us to the end of our meme video here. If you like my philosophical content and wish to see more of it, help get my channel off the ground by remembering to like, share, comment, and subscribe.